Hey guys, welcome back to RC. Got a fun little review video for you today. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Sanwa MX-V. This is a 3-channel radio from Sanwa, meant for sort of surface vehicles, cars, boats, that kind of thing. And so this is kind of rounding out my trilogy of entry-level radios. I've already reviewed the Futaba 3BV and the Spectrum DX5C, which are the main competitors for this radio in kind of the $100 entry-level class. So these $100 radios are basically what you're going to look at if you want to upgrade from an RTR radio, or maybe you want to do some simple club racing, or maybe you want to control a bunch of different vehicles, in case you have more than one RC car. So, you know, kind of the next step most people get into maybe when they're building a kit or upgrading from their RTR vehicles. So, very popular class. These videos seem to garner a lot of responses from viewers on my channel, so I'm happy to produce this next review. So the one in front of us is actually not mine. This is one I'm buying from my neighbor, but I did own a Sanwa MX-V for about a year. Have since sold it, basically upgraded to an MTS, but you know, obviously have a lot of experience and did get quite a bit of usage out of one of these. So feel pretty comfortable reviewing it. So this review is going to come through in a few different areas. So I'm going to basically kind of walk through the radio, show you how it works, the basic features, and then basically I'm going to review this radio in a bunch of different categories, basically ranking it or rating it on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is the worst and 10 is basically best of class, and 5 is not really a bad score, but it just kind of means it's average among other radios in this class. So keep that in mind when I go through those ratings. So here it is, the Sanwa MX-V, and a little quick history lesson. The Sanwa MX-V was actually imported in the US by a company called Airtronics, and you can see their name there on the back. Airtronics was the company bringing these in, and it was sort of co-branded, both Sanwa and Airtronics, but unfortunately Airtronics has got out of business, I think, as of about a year or two ago, and so no longer are they labeled as Airtronics radios, but just Sanwa radios. But if you find one of these that says Airtronics on the back, it's the exact same radio. There's no difference between the Sanwa and the Airtronics radios, and so it's just another label that's on the back there. So walking through this, so obviously this is a surface radio. You got a standard trigger and brake, and a nice little wheel here, and then basically 3 switches along the top. You've got basically one for I think steering trim, throttle trim, and then this is generally used for dual rate. Third channel, which is switched by this auxiliary switch here on the side. You know, I guess you would have to use your right hand to flick that, but that's how the third channel works, and that's pretty much it. Simple power switch here on the back. There's a little port here that looks like it might be, you know, sort of a charging port, but it's actually covered. It's not really a port, so there's no mention of that in the manual. And then finally underneath, standard 4 AA batteries here on the bottom. You can actually remove this tray and cut off the connector and put on like your own Futaba connector in case you want to run a Life battery or LiPo battery or something like that. I'll throw a link down. Actually, I wrote a post a couple years ago about how to do that on my blog, and you can check that out if you're interested in that. But pretty standard 4 AA's, nothing unusual there. So turning this thing on, there's actually a red little LED light that turns on, lets you know it's on. And what you'll see is basically the LCD menu system here. So there's 4 buttons, basically an up down to basically go through the different items on the menu, and then a plus minus if you want to adjust those values for that individual menu item. So walking through, so this radio's got pretty much all the standard adjustments you want to use when driving a car or boat or whatever. So first thing is dual rate. EPA, so basically this is endpoint adjustment, so you can adjust sort of left, how far you want to go, and then right, how far you want to go, and those can be different values that you can see. Then you move on to Expo. I'm sorry, there's also EPA for throttle and the auxiliary. On the Expo, you can basically have steering or throttle Expo. So this is basically the curve. So when you turn that wheel or pull that trigger, you can basically sort of accelerate or slow down the response. You know, maybe your steering's a little too twitchy, so you can put in some negative expo, slow it down right off, you know, neutral, and then that way make the car a little more controllable. Or maybe you want the throttle to be really aggressive or slow down, so you can use expo to adjust that. You know, not handy little feature, and definitely something you'll find in this class. Also, this supports anti-lock brakes, so it does actually allow you to run 3 different speeds for anti-lock brakes. Not really legal in racing, but I have played around with it, and it does actually work. And definitely if you want to make your car a little more controllable on the brakes, anti-lock brakes will allow you to do that. Next thing is trim, pretty standard thing for steering and throttle. And then you move on to the models. So there's 10 different models that you can program with this particular radio. Also sub-trim, very handy little feature. Basically allows you to make finer grain adjustments on the steering or throttle trim to get it dialed real close to exactly making it perfect for neutral steering or neutral throttle. Then obviously you can reverse all the different channels for either normal or reverse, in case your steering is backwards or your throttle's backwards or whatever. Then you can change the name on your different items. And then finally is the battery voltage of the radio. So this one's currently got 5.5 volts, plenty of juice to run the transmitter. So yeah, pretty simple radio, not a whole lot going on. Besides that, you also have a bind button, but really not a whole lot else going on. Pretty standard little radio. So let's kind of talk about this radio in a bunch of different categories. I'm going to give you my thoughts, basically rating it from 1 to 10. First thing I want to talk about is the features, and you've pretty much seen all of them, right? It's got all the basic adjustments you want in a radio, basically kind of dial in your vehicle with all the different settings for steering and throttle. Really the only advanced feature I'd say is the anti-lock brakes, but there's no telemetry. There's only 3 channels, and it's really just a switch channel. Nothing else too crazy going on, no stability control, no 4-wheel steering or mixing. So pretty kind of run-of-the-mill radio, and it's got enough to get you going, but nothing if you want to do anything too advanced with this radio. So features wise, I'm going to rate this a 4 out of 10, a little below average. Anti-lock brakes is kind of nice, and I did play around with that, but overall not a whole lot going on features wise. Let's move on to the next category, which is design, and this is a fairly modern looking radio. Pretty similar to kind of the other Sanwas in the class, the MT4 and M12 and stuff. They kind of have that same overall design with kind of the LCD display on top and all the different switches and stuff. The handle is also exactly the same as the higher end radio. So this handle is the same as the MTS. Simple plastic handle, nothing too fancy, no rubberized grips or anything, but solid, comfortable, and I do like it overall. So talking about the design, pretty standard, solid design. It's not quite as nice as the Futaba 3PV. I think the 3PV is a little more of a better design. The Spectrum DX5C, which I've also reviewed, maybe a little bit of a worse design. It's just so bulky and clunky. This one's, just kind of a nice, clean, solid looking radio. So I'm going to rate this on the design category a 5 out of 10. Moving on, let's talk about the controls. So as I mentioned, the grip is actually quite comfortable. It's got kind of more of a vertical style grip, not so swept back like the Futaba. The trigger has no slop, quite comfortable. The spring tension is quite stiff. Something you'll notice on this radio as compared to other radios is both the steering wheel and the trigger are quite stiff, definitely stiffer than average. No slop in the radio though. The steering wheel feels quite good. The foam is quite nice as well. Grippy, soft. The wheel's a little bit on the smaller side. This and the Futaba tend to be a little bit smaller than say the Spectrum, but I find it quite comfortable overall. No other adjustments for spring tension or trigger tension or anything like that. So pretty basic radio. I'm going to rate it a 5 out of 10 in the controls. If the springs were just a little softer, not quite so aggressively stiff like other, as compared to other radios, I'd probably rate it a little bit higher. The other thing you'll find with Sanwa radios is that the wheels also tend to sort of increase in tension as you turn the wheel. So kind of immediately off neutral, it's not that stiff, but then as you turn it more and more, it gets stiffer and stiffer, kind of ramps up in stiffness. That's just kind of a Sanwa thing. The Futaba and the Spectrum don't have that, but kind of a thing you may or may not like depending on if that's the kind of feature you'll like in your radio. So controls wise, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. Now let's talk about the construction, and overall I find Sanwa radios to have pretty good plastics. They're smooth but not super like flimsy or cheap looking. Overall, I think this is a pretty sturdy feeling radio. I have dropped one of these several times, had no issues with damage or whatever. So construction wise, I think this is a little bit above average. I'm going to rate it a 6 out of 10. You know, kind of, there's nothing really, you know, fragile or anything you'd worry about, like display wise or whatever. If you drop this thing, there's no antenna sticking out. So overall, I do like the construction overall. It feels very solid and, you know, pretty good overall. Moving on to performance, and what I mean by performance is basically how fast the radio responds, you know, what is the frame rate, latency, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, this is kind of the area where I think the MX-V loses out to its competitors. It's definitely noticeably a little bit slower than the other radios, and it's not so much that, you know, when you turn the wheel or pull the trigger, the car doesn't respond. But more that there's a little more vagueness, I would say, because the frame rate seems to be a little bit slower, not as frequent, and you know, the car is not going to be basically quite as exact is what you'll notice, I think. I mean, that's kind of what I feel. Based on the numbers I've seen, I think the frame rate on this is something like 16 milliseconds. Definitely on the slower side as compared to modern radios, but you know, it's not terrible. You can definitely still race it. You still definitely bash it, do whatever you like. You may not even notice. I mean, it's just something I noticed, but you know, a lot of people probably wouldn't notice. But overall, you know, maybe not quite as in tune and sort of precise feeling as the other radios. I mean, the actual physical components feel very good. I mean, the trigger has no slop. Same with the steering wheel, but maybe that performance, sort of that latency and precision is not quite as good. So I'm going to give it a little bit below average score. I'm going to rate it 4 out of 10. I've definitely used worse radios. The FlySky FS GT3C is even slower than this. But you know, overall, as compared to other radios in this class, I think a little bit on the slow side. Moving on, let's talk about the menu and the display. So the display is actually pretty nice. Very large, clear numbers and text. Obviously very easy to kind of scroll through and see what's going on. Not a ton of different menu items like the Futaba. The Futaba, I think, takes forever to scroll through all, you know, 17 different items. This one's a little more reasonable. So I think it's something like, I don't know, 13 or 14, but you know, very easy to sort of navigate and see what's going on, and easy to adjust. So the menu is solid. The display is solid as well. It's not got quite as a fancy display as some of the other radios in this class, but it definitely works overall. You know, I'm pretty happy with the display overall. I'm going to rate it average in this class, 5 out of 10. Nothing spectacular about the menu or display, but you know, it works. No issues, and you know, overall, fairly happy with that. Let's move on to binding, and this is one area where I feel like Sanwa's a little bit easier to use than some of the other radios. So the bind system is actually very simple. You just turn on the radio, and then you hold down the bind button on your receiver and turn on the car, and then you just hit that bind button, and that's it. The radio is bound to the receiver, and you can go ahead and drive. So binding is very clear. Binding is very simple, especially compared. There's no bind plugs or anything. The Spectrum's got some issues in that category, but I do like the binding system overall. I'm very familiar with it, so I'm going to rate this a 7 out of 10. Moving on, the battery. So let's talk about the battery, and what are the options here? Well, as I mentioned, you have 4 AA's, pretty standard. It doesn't explicitly have any connectors for LiPo or LiPo or nickel metal hydride battery, but you can actually take this off, cut off the wire, put on your own Futaba connector, and then plug in the battery of your choice. The other nice thing is that sort of this shape lends itself well to a lot of the Life batteries out there. So there are a lot of Life batteries that will fit right in that compartment. So that's kind of nice overall. And the cord also is definitely long enough to put on a connector without too many issues. So the battery overall, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I wish I had a Futaba connector or you know, some other easily connector to plug in different types of batteries rather than just 4 AA's. But you can cut that off and plug in your own, and so that does work. Let's move on to the manual, and I do not have the actual manual here, but I did print out basically a copy of the online file. So the manual it's solid overall, you know, no issues. It is black and white. It does come on sort of this simple basic paper, you know, no glossy paper or anything like that. But you know, the instructions are clear. You can definitely, you know, get everything you want to need to know how to adjust things. So the manual overall, you know, pretty average class. So 5 out of 10 for the manual. Now let's talk about the receivers for the Sanwa MX-V. So the Sanwa MX-V supports FHSS2, also known as FH2, and that is a Sanwa thing. The receiver it comes with is an RX371W, a waterproof receiver, not particularly small, not particularly fast or anything, but it is waterproof, so it's a solid receiver for doing some bashing or whatever. But on the downside, Sanwa receivers are by far the most expensive out of every other radio out there. I think the cheapest Sanwa receiver you can get is like $60, and you go all the way up to like over $100. They're just crazy expensive. Really the downfall, I think, of the Sanwa line, they're sort of a premium brand, sort of have a premium cost associated with them. So for Sanwas and the Sanwa MX-V, I'm going to rate the receivers a 3 out of 10. They're just really expensive, unfortunately. There's not too many ways around that. But it's just sort of the price you'll have to pay. So it would be expensive to try to run this with a lot of different cars. So maybe if you have 8 or 10 cars and you need 8 or 10 receivers, it is going to get pretty pricey pretty quickly. So that's sort of one of the areas I think the Sanwa loses out on. All right, so finally, let's talk about value. The Sanwa MX-V sells for $88. That is cheaper than some of the other radios on the market. The Spectrum DX5C and the Futaba 3PV sell for basically $110 each. So this is a little bit of a savings. Now, obviously, the features you get with the MX-V are not quite up to par with all the other two radios. So it's cheaper. But you do lose out on some features. You don't get a super fancy display. Overall, it's just kind of a solid radio. Nothing special, nothing unique about it, but a decent value overall. So I'm going to rate it a 5 out of 10. And it may seem like pretty much it's scoring like a 5 or 6 or 4 out of 10 in basically every category. That's kind of how I feel about this radio. It's a good solid radio, nothing wrong with it. There's nothing spectacular about it. If you're upgrading from Traxxas TQ radio or your Arma DX2E or whatever to a better radio, you want to control more cars, you want basically a few more adjustments to do some racing. This is going to work. Definitely better than, like a Fly Sky radio or some of those really cheap no-name brands. Good starter radio, nothing wrong with it. Overall, I think it's a pretty solid radio, and I'm going to rate it a 5 out of 10 value-wise. So that's pretty much it for my review. Not a whole lot to say about this radio. I mean, I like the way it looks. I like the way the handle feels. The trigger and steering wheel are quite nice overall, although a bit on the stiff side. Really, the downsides are the receivers are quite expensive, and sort of the spring tensions on these things are a little bit stiff, and the response is a little bit on the slow side. It's not terrible, but if you excuse me. If you're real sensitive response time, or you're real in tune with how your car performs and is reacting to your inputs, excuse me, I think you might notice a little bit of a slowness in this radio. So overall, solid radio. I did own one of these for a year, had no complaints, ran fine, worked overall. So yeah, that's pretty much it for my review. Now, I do also own Futaba 3PV and the Spectrum DX5C. You can see how big the Spectrum looks compared to these two. So, what I'm going to be doing is basically sort of testing these things out back to back to back in the same car, trying them out, seeing which one I like and which one performs better, and kind of giving a comparison. So look for a review video of that as well. Basically the entry-level $100 radio shootout between these three radios, and that'll be a fun one to do. So anyways, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe as always. That does help me out. And look for more videos soon. Bye.